On this day, 33 years ago, 4 teenage girls were brutally slain in a yogurt shop, Austin, Texas. The case has followed over 700 leads with over 50 false confessions. It's resulted in arrests and convictions, and then cases being dismissed. And after all of that, to this day, this heinous crime goes unsolved. This is the story of the Austin yogurt shop murders. It was the evening of Friday, December 6th, 1991. 4 teenage girls who were looking forward to a slumber party in a quiet part of Austin, Texas. Austin's very different than it is today. A lot less people live there, and it was just a regular Friday evening. 2 17-year-old friends, Eliza Thomas and Jennifer Harbison, were finishing up their shift in the I Can't Believe It's yogurt shop, and they've been joined by Jennifer's 15-year-old sister Sarah and Sarah's friend 13-year-old Amy Ayres. Even though they were kind of different ages, they'd become friends through their school's Future Farmers of America program. The plan was for them all to go back to the Harbison house after the shift ended at 11 p.m. The shop had a steady stream of customers, but the girls had eaten pizza during the shift. They'd ordered a pizza in, and they were just looking forward to going back to the Harbisons and kicking back. About an hour before closing, there was a man in there, and he was behaving kind of strangely. He spoke to another man who was in the queue, kind of furtively asking him if he was a cop. And this man said, "No, I'm not a cop." But he was actually an ex-cop, and he had a cop brain. And this guy was behaving oddly, like anxious, weird, possibly high, I don't know. And then he disappeared, and the ex-cop asked one of the girls, "Where did he go?" And she said, "Oh, he just went round the back for a pee." He came out, but this ex-cop didn't forget this man. Thought something odd about him. 15 minutes or so before the shop closed, a couple came in. They'd been to the movies and they wanted some dessert. They noted that there were 2 guys who also were behaving strangely, sat in one of the booths at the front of the shop. They noted that as they left, Jennifer locked up. It was usual to lock the doors so that they didn't get any new customers, but any current customers who were, still in there were allowed to stay for a little while. Obviously, they couldn't stay all night, but these 2 guys were locked in with the girls. Just before midnight, a police patrolman was just doing his usual routine, and he saw that the yogurt shop was on fire. He ran round the back while calling the fire service, and first responders were able to get in through the unlocked door at the back of the shop. It was thick smoke, and they couldn't see an inch in front of their faces until the flames and the smoke had subsided. What they saw was a horrific scene. Each of the 4 girls had been shot in the head. 2 different weapons had been used, a .22 caliber and a .38 caliber pistol. And this seemed to be very organised. The killer or killers had been able to control 4 victims. The door was unlocked at the back, yet nobody managed to escape, and each of them had been shot execution style. The bodies had been piled one on top of another, or that's how it looked. Initially, the first responders only saw 3 of the girls. Amy Ayres was a few feet away, and on further inspection, it does look like that she hadn't died instantly. She'd actually been shot twice. The first bullet missed her brain, and then the second bullet to her head maybe didn't kill her instantly. So shockingly, she'd managed to crawl away a few feet, and she was actually still alive, barely, and she died very soon after the first responders got in there. But this was very organised. An accelerant had been used, and to start the fire, they'd piled up loads of styrofoam and paper cups and tubs all around the girls and then lit it. So the 3 girls who were in the pile were virtually unrecognisable. Amy, however, was burnt but less seriously so than the other 3. Absolutely horrendous. To this day, the cops who were first on scene are still traumatised by what they saw. John Jones, who had been one of the first responders and he became the lead detective on the case, told the 48 Hours show, "I can see them. I can still see the inside of that place. That stuff indelibly burnt in my mind. 33 years later, this case is still there in the minds of those first responders, but also the families of these girls. Each of those 4 victims had their entire lives ahead of them. Their families lost so much that night, and yet still 33 years later, they're waiting for answers." Sonora Thomas, Eliza's sister, was only 13 when the murders happened. And she told 48 Hours, "There's a kind of torture that continues by the fact that it's unsolved and it's ongoing." The initial stages of the investigation have been criticised because so much evidence was lost. But John Jones said that this was a unique situation. Like, initially, they just thought this was a shop that had, set on fire. Maybe the kitchen or something had a fault. They didn't know that there were the bodies of 4 teenage girls who had been brutally murdered. In there, they couldn't see an inch in front of the face. John Jones told 48 Hours, "The fire department had just knocked down the fire. There was still a lot of water in there, a lot of smoke still. It was all muted greys, blacks. There was no colour in there, with the exception of the girls. Every surface was covered with a thick layer of black soot. They can't fingerprint, they can't DNA test surfaces that have been so badly compromised." I don't think the officers could have done anything other than, get that fire out and then start the investigation. The 4 girls had been gagged and tied up with articles of their own clothing, and as I said previously, shot in the head, execution style. 3 of them died probably instantly, but Amy wasn't killed instantly, and she had tried to crawl away. Absolutely horrendous. The crime was like none that the cops in Austin had ever seen before. There was a fire investigation, and it became clear that that fire had been started by the use of an accelerant, and it was a way to get rid of evidence, and it worked. But the shell casings, the bullets, were all there. They knew that a 38 and a 22 caliber pistol had been used. They recovered all of the rounds, and although the weapons hadn't been found, the type of weapons used was the thing that they used to come up with suspects. One of those early suspects was a teenager, just 16 at the time, someone called Maurice Pierce. He'd been arrested 8 days after the murders at a mall near the shop, carrying a 22 caliber gun. His weapon was confiscated, tested. His 22 caliber didn't match the rounds that were found at the crime scene. That said, Maurice Pierce kind of confessed. He said he was driving a getaway car and that 3 of his acquaintances, Forrest Welburn, Michael Scott and Robert Springsteen, were the ones who were involved in the murders. But his story kind of fell apart. John Jones told 48 Hours. It started to crater when we wired him up to talk to Forrest Wellburn. We were listening in on the wire, and it was pretty obvious Forrest didn't know what Maurice was talking about. And when Wellburn, Scott and Springsteen were brought in for questioning, they too denied any involvement. It was decided there was not enough evidence to charge them, and the search for other suspects continued. And then there was the Mexican. A witness had given information to the cops about a man who had been parked close to the yogurt shop shortly before the murders occurred. And the police sketch was eerily similar to a man that investigators in the sex crimes unit recognised. 3 weeks before the yogurt shop murders, a young woman in another part of Austin had been kidnapped and sexually assaulted. Police had released a sketch of 3 men wanted in connection with that crime. One of those suspects was strikingly similar to the man that a witness had seen parked outside the shop shortly before the murders. A tip came in that a couple of these Mexican guys had fled back to Mexico. 2 were caught and arrested, including the one who resembled this police sketch. The Mexican government took them in. Cops there had interrogated them, and it was announced to the world that they confessed. However, those confessions were coerced, and the details that they'd given didn't match the crime scene. So that was another dead lead. Finally, 8 years after the murders, in 1999, 4 arrests were made. A news report said, after nearly 8 years, Austinites are getting some answers in the case of the yogurt shop murders. At a press conference, the mayor, Kirk Watson, said, "I want to start off by thanking y'all for joining me here today. For almost 8 years, we've all waited to hear the words that our police department is close to a point of solving the crime that has haunted our very souls. Today is the day." No, he didn't actually say that. He said, "Today, we finally get to hear those words." Sarah, Jennifer, Amy, Eliza, we did not forget. The girls' families were in a state of utter turmoil. Was this finally the beginning of the closure that these families so badly needed? There have been so many false leads, false confessions. Did they this time have the right guys? And guess what? It was the guys who'd been questioned and looked at very early on in the investigation. Pierce, Wellborn, Scott and Springsteen. But there was no new physical evidence tying any of these guys who'd been looked at early on in the investigation. But what police did have, and what the entire case was based on, was 2 newly obtained confessions. One from Michael Scott and another from Robert Springsteen. Michael Scott's confession came first. He was questioned for over 20 hours over a 5-day period. One of the officers had actually held a gun to his head.
Have you ever seen that gun before?
I'm not positive.
Does that look like a gun you've seen before?
It looks like a gun I've seen before, but I'm not positive.
Is that the gun you shot somebody with, Mike?
I don't.
Is that the gun you walked up behind somebody with and shot in the head? Is that the one? Talk to me, Mike.
Yes, sir.
You did that, didn't you?
Yes, sir.
We've installed some more doors, haven't we, Mike?
Not really.
You sure?
Yes, sir.
Michael Scott, during this confession, after he'd had this gun pointed at him, said, "I remember seeing girls. I remember one girl screaming, terrified." He told investigators that he and the others had intended just a simple robbery. And indeed, $540 had gone from the till. So that made sense. He said they cased the yogurt shop earlier that day, and then after dark, they came back armed with 2 guns. Investigators claim that Robert Springsteen later corroborated much of what Scott had said. But again, this was after intense questioning. Robert Springsteen admitted to raping one of the girls. And indeed, at least 2 of them had been sexually assaulted. So there was details here that fit the crime scene. So, this was a heavy way to interrogate these guys to get confessions out of them. But were they the right guys? Wellborn had been questioned multiple times over the years, and he never wavered. He said, "I absolutely did not do this." And it wasn't long before the case against M began to crumble. Charges against Forrest Wellborn were dismissed after 2 grand juries failed to indict him. And later on, charges were dropped against Maurice Pierce as well. There were Scott and Springsteen's confessions implicating them, but nothing else. Nothing linked them to this horrendous crime. However, the cases against Michael Scott and Robert Springsteen stuck. The trial against Robert Springsteen lasted 3 weeks. The jury deliberated for 13 hours before reaching a verdict. Guilty. Springsteen was sentenced to death. Michael Scott was next to go on trial, and he was also convicted, sentenced to life in prison. But the case didn't end there. There was a shocking turn of events. The case went all the way to the Supreme Court. The conviction against Michael Scott was overturned because his constitutional rights had been violated. The Sixth Amendment gives defendants the right to confront their accusers, and in both the Scott and the Springsteen trials, their confessions were used against one another, but they weren't allowed to question each other in court. So their cases were dismissed. However, they weren't released. A new district attorney, Rosemary Lemberg, was determined to retry them. In an effort to find more evidence, her office ordered DNA tests on the vaginal swabs taken from the victims at the time of the murders. There was a new technique out now called YSTR testing. It was able to tease out male DNA only from a mixed sample. A partial DNA profile of an unknown male was obtained from one of the victims, but up to this point they weren't able to do anything with it because the technology just wasn't advanced enough. But when they got the results of this YSTR testing, the DNA didn't match any of the 4 young men who were originally accused, including Scott and Springsteen, who had been convicted of these crimes. The DNA did not match, yet Springsteen had confessed to raping one of the girls, but under coercion. The new trials against Scott and Springsteen just fell apart. The district attorney wouldn't let it drop. She focused on finding the source of that DNA, thinking, well, Scott and Springsteen are guilty, but there's another guy who did the raping who left the DNA. Rosemary Lemberg told 48 Hours, "I remain really confident that both Springsteen and Scott were responsible for killing those 4 girls." But in 2009, with no further matches found for this DNA, Lemberg was forced to drop the charges against Springsteen and Scott. After nearly 10 years behind bars, they were finally released, but not exonerated, leaving it open for the possibility that they could be retried at a later date. But that was 2009. We are now in 2024, and this case is still unsolved. But 33 years ago, to this very day, the most heinous crime against 4 teenagers who had their whole lives ahead of them just snuffed out in an organised manner. I don't know that 15 and 16-year-old lads would be able to organise a scene that well to get rid of virtually all of the evidence. Seems way too planned to me. We don't know. We have no answers. Let me know what you think. This is quite a well-known case. You may have heard of it before. Let me know in the comments, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye, guys.